Enjoy a narrated virtual tour of helicopters that are at the National Naval Aviation Museum. See photos and videos that cover a range of helicopters starting with the Sikorsky HNS Hoverfly through the Bell AH-1W Sea Cobra. Some of the photos and videos in this tour are of the same model helicopters but were captured at other museums or air shows. The museum is located on Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida. Sikorsky's HNS Hoverfly was naval aviation's first helicopter, and the adoption of the new aircraft type was spearheaded by Coast Guard aviators. When first delivered in late 1943, it was intended to serve only to train pilots, yet it soon assumed operational research and development roles, participating in actual life-saving operations and serving as the platform for developing hoisting equipment for search and rescue. In January 1944, the Hoverfly executed the first helicopter mission of mercy, flying through unfavorable weather to deliver blood plasma to victims of an explosion aboard the destroyer USS Turner in New York Harbor. Development of the HNS-1 continued through World War II in both Atlantic and Pacific operating areas, with versions of the Hoverfly also used by Great Britain and the U.S. Army Air Forces, the latter employing one in a rescue under combat conditions in the China-Burma-India theater. Initially used primarily as a utility aircraft, the HO-3S became the first helicopter employed in plane guard duty on board aircraft carriers, standing by to recover pilots forced to ditch during flight operations. Fitted with folding blades for shipboard stowage and an externally mounted hoist, they were operational aboard ship by 1948, replacing SC-1 floatplanes on cruisers, the first rotary wing aircraft to replace a fixed-wing platform in naval aviation. With the outbreak of war in Korea, the aircraft assumed a new role as a combat rescue helicopter, rescuing downed aircrew and performing medical evacuation of injured ground personnel. In 1946 the Navy issued its first contract for procurement of Bell's Model 47, which was designated the HTL Su, later redesignated H-13. The last Su retired from the naval inventory in 1973 and all told the Navy procured a total of 187 examples. With two covered litters mounted on their skids, Marine Corps Su saved many lives by evacuating battlefield casualties to aid stations during the Korean War, where helicopters of all services were credited with airlifting nearly 40,000 wounded personnel. Among famous students who flew Sus were Apollo astronauts, who logged time in the helicopters to familiarize themselves with its auto-rotation sync rate, which was deemed to be viable simulation training for operating the lunar module in its landing on the Moon. On November 11, 1963, astronaut Lieutenant Commander James A. Lovell made his first helicopter indoctrination flight in this helicopter, which by that time had been redesignated a TH-13M. Hiller Corporation introduced their Model 360 helicopter with a new rotormatic cyclic control system that provided a high degree of stability and made the helicopter easier to control. During the Korean War, production shifted to the military with the Navy ordering 16 designated as HTE, while the Army ordered hundreds of them. They served both branches in medical evacuation, observation, training, and utility roles, with the medevac version carrying two external skid-mounted litters. The museum's HTE entered service in 1951. Appropriately nicknamed Retriever, the Piasecki HUP was carried aboard all aircraft carriers, their compact framework allowing for easy stowage. Further, in 1955 a Retriever became the first aircraft to land on a nuclear-powered vessel, its wheels touching down on the submarine Nautilus. Its primary missions were search and rescue and plane guard duty on board aircraft carriers, its capabilities enhanced by the installation of a rescue hoist that lowered through a floor hatch that was wide enough to allow for the passage of a loaded stretcher. A later version, HUP-2S, was equipped with dipping sonar and flew in the anti-submarine warfare role, and the HUP-3 held the distinction of being the first production helicopter equipped with an automatic pilot system, though its unreliability precluded it from seeing much use. The Retriever's tandem overlapping rotor configuration was used in future helicopter designs, notably the CH46C Night. The museum's HUP-3 was acquired in 1988. Originally a two-seat design, Sikorsky's HO-5S incorporated 4 seats in its military configuration and saw use primarily with the Marine Corps during the Korean War as an observation and scouting aircraft and for day and night medical evacuation of personnel. It could carry 2 wounded Marines on stretchers internally, an advantage over the HTL which could only carry stretchers externally. Even though in the hands of a Sikorsky test pilot it established a world helicopter speed record, military pilots found it speed deficient when it came to the missions it was tasked to perform, plus its small cabin size and relatively limited range also worked against it. In September 1952, 8 HO-5S-1Gs were delivered to the U.S. Coast Guard, but were found to be too slow, small, and short-ranged for the air-sea rescue mission and were placed in storage beginning in April 1954. Sikorsky's H-34 Seabat was a major advancement over its predecessors and was primarily employed in 2 missions. One was anti-submarine as it carried sonar equipment and homing torpedoes, and the second was as a transport that could carry up to 18 troops, double the earlier helicopters. They served as the airlift platform for the Marine Corps airborne assault squadrons early in the Vietnam War, delivering troops and evacuating wounded Marines. Seabats remained in service with United States Army and Marine Corps aviation units into the late 1960s. They were retired from service in the U.S. military by the early 1970s, the type having the distinction of being the last piston-engine helicopter operated by the Marine Corps. Although capable of carrying over 20 combat troops, Sikorsky's CH37M Mojave proved its greatest value in the transport of vehicles and cargo that was loaded and unloaded through clamshell nose doors. By the time U.S. Marines went ashore at Da Nang in the Republic of Vietnam in March 1960, only 2 of the Marine Corps 20 helicopter squadrons still flew them. In 1962, the Navy ordered Boeing's HRB, later designated CH46C Night, that featured a rear cargo loading ramp, a top speed of 166 miles per hour, and the ability to carry 4,000 pounds of cargo or 22 combat-equipped troops. The first Sea Nights were delivered in June 1964, and as U.S. operations intensified in South Vietnam, a concerted effort was made to deploy them in country to augment and ultimately replace the UH-34s and Marine medium helicopter squadrons. The first squadron of Sea Nights arrived in theater in March 1966, and during the first 35 days of operations, flew almost 2,700 combat sorties in the Sea Nights' baptism of fire. Deadly structural failures for a time grounded the aircraft, but over time and with the introduction of the more capable CH46D version of the Sea Night, the helicopter affectionately known as the Frog became a mainstay of the Vietnam War. Over the course of the first true helicopter war, 106 Leatherneck Sea Nights fell to enemy fire in missions ranging from supplying remote base camps to battlefield insertion and extraction to medical evacuation. The final flight for a Marine Corps Sea Night in South Vietnam occurred on April 30, 1975, when a Frog extracted the last leathernecks of the Marine security detail from the rooftop of the American Embassy during the evacuation of Saigon. Sea Nights continued to serve the Marine Corps for the ensuing 4 decades, with Marine expeditionary units typically including them on board amphibious assault ships to transport leathernecks ashore. The last version of the helicopter, the CH46E, saw heavy combat service in the global war on terror in the sands of Iraq and the rugged terrain of Afghanistan. Following delivery in 1963, Sikorsky's HH52 Sea Guard served as the Coast Guard's premier search and rescue aircraft for nearly a quarter-century. It had a turboshaft engine, which was more powerful and lighter than the piston engines, and featured a watertight hull and stabilizing floats that enabled it to land on water or in deep snow. Though smaller, the Sea Guard was similar in appearance to the Navy's SH60 King, and held the distinction of being the first turbine-engine rotary wing aircraft to be certified. It was well suited for air-sea rescue in that it was fully amphibious with the main wheels semi-retracted into sponsons located on both sides of the fuselage. The helicopter also employed a folding platform along the side of the fuselage and a winch above the door, both of which facilitated hovering rescue. The Sea Guard was withdrawn from Coast Guard service during 1989 in favor of non-amphibious rotorcraft, such as the Eurocopter HH-65 Dolphin, which rely solely on the use of a winch from a low hover to conduct rescue operations. The museum Sea Guard entered service in 1963 and was operational until 1987. Sikorsky's H3C King started as a medium-lift cargo and personnel transport aircraft. The Navy added an anti-submarine warfare package, making it a submarine hunter. It was again adapted to a search and rescue platform for service in Vietnam. Later, Sea Kings were instrumental in recovering astronauts and space capsules during the Gemini and Apollo projects. This VH-3A Sea King flew Presidents Nixon and Ford during the 1970s as part of the Marine Corps mission to provide short-range helicopter transportation to the President. The Marine Corps is the primary user of the Sikorsky CH53C Stallion heavy-lift helicopter. Sea Stallions have been in use since 1966 and are still used today. It is the largest and heaviest helicopter in the U.S. military and can either carry 37 combat-equipped Marines, 24 wounded personnel on litters, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. While the Sikorsky SH60 Seahawks specializes in anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare, a number of Seahawks variants exist, each fulfilling a unique role. Packed with an array of advanced sensors and avionics, and capable of carrying a variety of ordnance, the SH60B has been a deadly part of the Navy's arsenal since the 1970s. The Navy based its new maritime helicopter requirements on the Army's UH-60 Black Hawk to achieve commonality and lower cost, maintaining 83% commonality with the UH-60A. The main changes were corrosion protection, more powerful T700 engines, single-stage oleo main landing gear, removal of the left side door, adding 2 weapon pylons, and shifting the tail landing gear 13 feet forward to reduce the footprint for shipboard landing. The SH-60B entered operational service in 1984 with its first operational deployment in 1985 and is being replaced by the Navy's newest helicopter, the MH-60R. The Bell UH1 Iroquois entered naval service in 1964, when the Marine Corps procured the UH1E version, accepting 192 examples along with 20 additional TH1E versions for crew training. The Navy followed suit in 1968 with procurement of 27 HH1K versions, which were similar to the UH1E except for a different engine and improved avionics. More advanced versions followed in the ensuing decades, the Huey performing a host of missions to include heliborne assault, command and control, search and rescue, medical evacuation, support of operations in the Antarctic as part of Operation Deep Freeze, light utility, and training. In 1967 the aircraft was chosen to outfit Helicopter Attack Squadron Light 3, the first squadron of its type in naval aviation history. Nicknamed the Seawolves, HAL 3 served in concert with SEALs and Navy patrol boats interdicting the enemy in the waters of the Mekong Delta. Bell's versatile Jet Ranger 206, a staple in civilian aviation circles, drew the interest of the Navy during the Vietnam War. Procured in 1968 and designated the TH-57C Ranger, the helicopter remains the platform in which all Navy, Marine Corps and Coast Guard helicopter pilots are trained. Although primarily used for helicopter flight training, these aircraft were also used for photo, chase, and utility missions. By the early 1980s, with the introduction of the improved TH-57B and TH-57C versions of the Sea Ranger, the latter featuring a full array of instruments, the type had become naval aviation's primary training helicopter. Prospective Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard helicopter pilots spend approximately 106 hours flying the Sea Ranger before receiving their wings. During this training they learn aerodynamic and engineering qualities of rotary wing aircraft and how to hover. They also learn basic instrument techniques, radio navigation, rough terrain landing, night and formation flying, emergency procedures like auto-rotation, shipboard operations, and helicopter tactics. Its retirement began in 2023 and is expected to conclude in 2025. The first Marine Corps Bell AH-1JC Cobra helicopters entered service in the latter stages of the Vietnam War, operating at night from the deck of the amphibious assault ship Cleveland off the coast of North Vietnam in support of blockade operations in Operation Marhook. The squadron interdicted small boat traffic ferrying cargo from merchant ships to landing sites off the North Vietnamese coast. It flew combat sorties in the last chapter of America's experience in Vietnam, covering the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in April 1975. The AH-1W Super Cobra entered service in 1986 and served on the front lines during Operation Desert Storm, where they destroyed 97 tanks and 104 armored personnel carriers and vehicles. The Super Cobra continued operations in the global war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. The museum's example of the AH-1J was used as a maintenance trainer at Camp Pendleton, California before its 1991 acquisition. I hope you enjoyed this narrated virtual tour of the National Naval Aviation Museum's helicopters. If you would like to tour other aircraft in this series, you will find convenient links in the description section below this video. Here are YouTube suggested links on a similar topic that you may enjoy viewing.